He was stripped on a winter morning beside the Tiber, teeth chattering, hands raw from rope. The river breathed a grey fog. They forced him into a bellowing leather sack. Something alive whined, something wet pressed against his shoulder. A seam was driven closed, the leather cinched tight, and the sack, sealed as if sealing a verdict, was pitched into the current. There would be no funeral pyre, no lament at the family tomb, no rites to ease his passage. The city watched, and then it unmade him. Body, name, place. This was not merely execution, it was erasure. This was Rome making language of punishment. The promise behind the title is straightforward and bleak. The 12 barbaric Roman punishments that history wants you to forget. Each of these methods, some statutory, some ceremonial, some anecdotal, was a tool. Their goal was rarely simple retribution. More often they enacted a public grammar of shame, deterrence, and political theatre. Over the next hour, we will move through 12 such practices. For each, a short reconstruction, the legal or ritual mechanics, which ancient authors describe it and how reliable they are, what social or political function the punishment served, and what modern historians still argue about. Where a story rests on one vivid old voice, I will say so. Where a method is securely embedded in Roman law, I will say that too. The Rome of aqueducts, roads, and law codes also fashioned punishments meant to unmake persons. That tension, engineering and cruelty, will hold us together. Poena cule, the sack punishment for parricide, comes first because nothing in Roman punitive vocabulary combines symbolic annihilation and legal specificity as clearly. Imagine a courtyard, dawn cold. A father's murder has been discovered. The son stands bound. The city does not simply carry him to the forum. According to the wording preserved through later jurists and the echo of ritual in Cicero's speeches, he is sewn into a heavy leather cullis, together with animals. A dog, a rooster, and a viper are named in some accounts. The sack is tied, perhaps with lead sewn over the stitch in some later formalizations, and the offender is thrown into a river or the sea. Legally, the punishment is attested in fragments of early Roman law and discussed by jurists of the imperial era. Cicero condemns parricide in his rhetoric about familial duty. Later, Roman legal compilers refer to poena cule as a prescribed sanction. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest codification, establish parricide as distinctively contemptible, and subsequent jurists show a ritualized penalty attached to it. Primary source reliability is mixed. Cicero and legal compilations report a formalized ritual, but descriptions vary across time and place. We should note that the gruesome list of animals and the precise mechanics shift in the records. Functionally, the sack does double work. It kills the body and denies the social corpse. Burial rites, without which the dead were, in Roman belief, denied full passage to the ancestral world. The animals inside the sack are not incidental. They are a theatrical inversion of household duties, domestic creatures swallowed with the man who betrayed familial order. The spectacle communicates, "You have violated the most sacred unit of Roman society, and you will be returned to nature in a way that obliterates civic identity." Historiographical caveat. Descriptions come through legal tradition and rhetorical authors who have reasons to emphasize the horror of parricide. Modern scholars point out regional and chronological variation in the practice and caution against assuming the same ritual detail everywhere. Some elements, like the specific assortment of animals, may be rhetorical embellishment intended to underline the crime's abomination. Ancient report. Modern scholars debate prevalence. If the sack punished the soul, the Tarpeian rock punished ambition. Picture the Capitoline slope, limestone dropping away to a jutting ledge. In the early Republic, traitors were hurled from the Rup Tarpeia for betraying the city. Livy tells the story of traitors and of the rock's grim use as a civic instrument, to cast out the man whose treason threatened the Republic's survival. The image is simple and archaic. One thrust, one fall, but it communicates civic expulsion as finality. It is throwing the betrayer beyond the polity, an act both physical and legal. You are removed from civic life by force. The Tarpeian rock is attested in Livy and other annalists. Its legendary origin, Tarpeia herself, blends myth and memory. When Livy recounts specific instances of traitors cast from the rock, he writes as moralizer and chronicler. His aim is partly pedagogical. Functionally, the rock's violence is symbolic. Treason is not merely a crime, but a removal from the moral and physical city. Historians debate how often the rock was used in later republican and imperial practice. During much of Rome's long history, condemnation took other forms. Thus, while the rock looms large in narrative tradition, its practical role as institutional punishment across centuries is not uniform. Livy, narrative, rhetorical. Modern scholars debate later prevalence. Military discipline fashioned punishments that turned comrades into executioners. Decimation, decimatio, is the most famous and feared. Imagine a cohort after mass cowardice or mutiny. The unit stands under a whip's shadow as officers draw lots. 1 man in every 10 is chosen by lot, stripped, and killed by his fellows, stoned or clubbed, while the surviving 9 endure humiliation and duty in degraded garments. The ritual is brutally efficient. It punishes the many by legally obliging the many to kill one, binding collective responsibility to individual fate. Ancient accounts of decimation come from Livy, Appian, and later writers. Vegetius, writing in the late Empire, codifies the practice as a military discipline. Polybius, too, reflects on Roman martial rigor. The historical instances are sporadic. Decimation appears as a sanction for breakdowns in discipline or morale, not as routine practice. Its political function is clear. It installs terror and a sense of shared culpability, reminding soldiers that personal survival is subordinate to the unit's cohesion. Modern historians note that decimation was rare because, for the army, the cost in trained manpower was high. When employed, it was a statement of desperation and control. Ancient reports, rare but real, according to most scholars. Fustuarium moves from the mass to the individual within fold of military law. The fustuarium, beating to death by cudgel, was prescribed for offences such as desertion, sleeping on post, or allowing the enemy to raid the camp. Visualize a ranks-assembled ritual. A tribune signals a transgression, rods or cudgels appear, and punishment is enacted as demonstration rather than private correction. The physicality of fustuarium, rod, public setting, repetitive blows, aims to remake the soldier by force. The practice is attested in military manuals and recounted by Livy and Vegetius. Legal roots are older, embedded in the army's need to maintain order where informal bonds could not suffice. Its function is regulatory, to produce uniformity of behavior through visible coercion. Historiographically, scholars remind us that accounts of fustuarium sometimes mix discipline and legend, and that formal regulations evolved over time, with variations between the Republican legions and the imperial army. Ancient description, contextual evolution. When state violence required the slowest, most public of deaths, Rome did not hesitate. Crucifixion. To picture it is to picture endurance. The flagellum, the carried patibulum, nailing or binding to crossbeams under an exposed sky. The condemned were often scourged first, their backs raw, and then fixed to a cross where death by exposure and asphyxiation could take hours or days. Crucifixion was both punishment and message, a slow agony in a visible spot, often along roads to mark the punished as example. Sources like Plutarch and Seneca describe the moral horror of crucifixion. Evidence in Roman practice shows it reserved for the lowest classes, non-citizens, slaves, insurgents, and for the worst political offences. The mass crucifixions ordered by Marcus Licinius Crassus after the suppression of Spartacus's slave revolt are attested by Plutarch and Appian. Hundreds crucified along the Appian Way as a literal reinforcement of Rome's authority. Juridically, citizens were generally protected from crucifixion. Roman legal distinction between citizen and non-citizen mattered. Historians emphasize the performative function of crucifixion, a discipline of the road and a signal to those who might rebel. Primary sources with strong corroboration for particular events. Ritualized role of shame. The arena took execution and turned it into ritual theater. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, was two things at once: a legal sentence and a public spectacle. A condemned criminal or prisoner was released into an enclosed space with a wild animal, lion, bear, or otherwise, and left to the crowd's horror and thrill. The scene could be part of games that reenacted mythic hunts or portrayed civic morality plays. A king is devoured for tyranny. A mythic monster is staged for educational atrocity. Martial, Juvenal, and other satirists described the arena's theatricality. Pliny and Tacitus note regenerative elements, emperors offering games to the populace, using bodies as tokens of piety and power. Functionally, damnatio ad bestias enforced a double lesson. It satisfied a hunger for spectacle and taught obedience. The historiographical thread cautions against conflating arena spectacles with ordinary judicial practice. Not every execution became a gladiatorial set-piece, and the meanings of these displays shifted across the Republican Empire, ancient literary sources, cultural complexity debated by modern scholars. Fire has always had political optics. Mors per ignem, death by burning, occupies special place in Roman memory because of the stories attached to Nero. Tacitus, Suetonius, and later Christian writers record narratives in which Nero dressed Christians in tunics doused in oil and set them alight to illuminate his gardens at night. People transformed into torches. Tacitus writes the account with a mixture of horror and rhetorical distance. Suetonius adds scandal. Pliny records other instances of burning as a sentence, yet historians urge caution. Nero was a posthumous scandal figure, and his enemies' accounts shape what we remember as spectacle. Burning served several symbolic ends. It destroyed body and relic, addressed crimes thought to pollute, and could be cast as divine judgment when framed in religious rhetoric. The flames were not merely punitive. They were statements about sacrilege, impurity, and the sovereign's capacity to determine who was unworthy of civic burial. Again, many severe accounts of Nero may emphasize theatrical cruelty for polemical purposes. The sources are vivid, but not always impartial. Tacitus and Suetonius report their biases should be considered. States that wanted to declare absolute dominion sometimes deployed animals not to maul, but to crush. Execution by elephant, pulveratio, is attested in Roman and near-Roman literature as a spectacular method of breaking bodies into fragments. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, remarks upon the use of elephants in punitive displays and wartime spectacles. The elephant is an imperial symbol. To employ such an animal in execution binds imperial capacity to natural force. The state can marshal beasts and, through them, annihilate human adversaries. Such executions were relatively rare in Rome proper, and often appear in accounts of Eastern wars or triumphal celebrations where exotic animals were available. Here again, the political function is paramount. The use of elephants was as much about imperial theater and exotic demonstration of reach as it was about literal punishment. Archaeological and literary traces hint at occasional use. Modern scholars consider many detailed anecdotes to be rhetorical amplification more than bureaucratic routine. Pliny records, context often ornamental. One punishment on our list is the most contested: scaphism or scaphism, a method described by ancient biographers as practiced by Persians and reported in Roman sources as a foreign, dreadful art of execution. The scene is awful in the ancient telling. A victim is forced between two boats or placed within a hollowed tree trunk, smeared with food and milk to attract insects, and left to be eaten alive over days. Plutarch recounts such stories and gives them a foreign provenance. Later, Latin compilers repeat the narrative. Here the historiographical caveat must be loud and clear. Accounts of scaphism come through literary genres prone to exoticization. Plutarch and others report it as an example of Oriental cruelty, often to contrast Roman or Greek norms. Modern historians generally treat scaphism as an anecdote about how classical authors depicted their enemies, not as evidence of an organized Roman legal penalty. If we include it among 12 barbaric punishments, we do so as a reported method that circulated in ancient literature, not as a codified Roman sanction, and we mark its provenance accordingly. Plutarch, reported as foreign practice. Modern scholars debate authenticity and frequency. From bodily punishment to the punishment of memory. Damnatio memoriae. This was not a method of instant death, but a judicial and social effort to erase an individual from civic recollection. Names were chiseled away from inscriptions, portraits defaced, and public honors rescinded. The goal was to render the person as if they had never existed in the city's commemorative landscape. We see damnatio memoriae applied to emperors, officials, and traitors in sources like Cassius Dio and inscriptions themselves. Domitian is often cited as a case where the Senate sought to erase the emperor's memory after assassination, though the record is messy and suggests political motives as much as moral outrage. Archaeology supplies corroboration, deliberate erasures, missing coin types, palimpsest inscriptions. Functionally, this punishment performed a civic unmaking that complemented physical execution. If the body could be punished, memory could be kinder to the state when eradicated. Historiography warns against reading damnatio memoriae as absolute. Erasure was rarely total, often contested, and sometimes reversible when political tides shifted. Religion supplied punishments unique to Rome's spiritual grammar. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses dedicated to Vesta, enjoyed privileges, but also faced a singular penalty for violating the taboo of chastity: live burial. Imagine the ritual paradox. A Vestal discovered to have broken her vow is condemned not simply to die, but to be placed within an underground chamber with a small supply of food and water, enchained to a subterranean fate. Romans rationalized this legal fiction by asserting that spilling a Vestal's blood was taboo. Thus, the state contrived a death that maintained ritual purity while ensuring severe punishment. Ancient historians such as Livy and other annalists record instances where Vestals were punished in this way. The late Republican case of a Vestal named Cornelia is sometimes cited in literary tradition. The procedure sits at the intersection of law, religion, and taboo. The state could neither openly shed sacred blood nor ignore a violation of order. Historians note that the legal fiction of minimizing sacrilegious defilement coexisted with harsh social condemnation. The Vestal's death served as ritual purification and as a warning about the fusion of sexual morality and civic stability. Ancient record ritualized legal rationalization. If burial could be withheld as an instrument of punishment, then interdictio sepulturae, denial of burial, was a form of social annihilation. The dead in Rome required rites not only for piety, but for property and memory. Denying burial meant the family could not claim the corpse. It meant exclusion from ancestral cults and legal claims. It meant the social network severed. Cicero and other authors refer to the horror of such sanctions in orations attacking tyrants or defending citizens. Denial of burial functioned as an extra-legal ostracism. To die was one thing. To be denied passage to the ancestral realm was another. Historiography points out that denial of burial could be both formal, declared by magistrates, and informal, an effect of social ostracism. Its potency arose from Roman emphasis on ancestral rites. To remove those rights was to remove social existence. The punitive range could be broad, from legal interdictions against specific families to ad hoc refusals that socially excluded survivors. We pause here for a historiographical note. The ancient record is uneven. Some punishments are embedded in law codes or repeatedly corroborated by several independent authors. Others survive in single, vivid narratives that ancient writers used for rhetorical weight. Where a method is attested by one sensational voice, treat it as a report rather than as a universal practice. The caution is not moral relativism, it is historical rigor. Our aim is to let the sources speak, and to remind the viewer that Roman authors had angles, audiences, and genres. Between these discrete punishments, the Roman state cultivated a language of spectacle. Executions unfolded in public as pedagogy. The forum, the road, the arena, and the riverbank were all theaters where the state taught obedience. The visibility of punishment mattered as much as the punishment itself. Public ritual turned law into lesson. Bodies punished were visible sermons on the consequences of crime. This theatricality also reflects power relations, what could be shown and who could be displayed, and reveals a polity willing to bind civic identity to public spectacle. Returning to the list, let us consider the interplay of legalism and spectacle in greater detail. Crucifixion and damnatio ad bestias are the category of execution meant to be seen by many. The sack, the rock, and the burial are meant to remove. The military punishments, decimation and fustuarium, convert social bonds into instruments of enforcement. Burning and elephant execution invoke natural elements and exotic animals to signal imperial reach. Scaphism appears as an imported horror in the author's imaginations. Damnatio memoriae and denial of burial treat the dead as legal objects. The state could erase names and sever familial rights. The Vestal's live burial shows religion folding into legal form. Each punishment is a node in a larger system: law, ritual, theater, and memory. Consider the case of Spartacus and Crassus. Ancient writers, Plutarch and Appian among them, describe how thousands of surrendered or captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way after the revolt's suppression. The mass crucifixions served multiple functions: deterrence, public terror, and a demonstration of restored control. The route of punishment, visible and long, turned a road into a ledge of warning for travelers and subjects. The sources are consistent enough about the event to consider it a historical episode, and its interpretation remains a clear example of how punishment could be used for political theater. Another episode worth reflection is the practice of erasing an emperor's memory. The case of Domitian is illustrative. After his assassination, the Senate sought to erase him, his name struck from monuments, his images broken. Cassius Dio and Suetonius report this political cleansing. Archaeological evidence, like chiseled inscriptions and sudden gaps in coinage, supports the existence of damnatio memoriae as a political tool. But the severity was uneven and ideological. Later emperors could rehabilitate reputations. The point is institutional. Memory could be penalized just as bodies could be punished. We should also consider the audience for punishment. Punitive spectacle was not a monologue delivered by the state to anonymous masses. It was interactive, feeding local identities, family ambitions, and political rivalries. Spectacles bound spectators into a civic sensibility that calibrated what was permissible and what was not. The shame inflicted on the punished could be transferred to kin, clients, and political factions. Thus, punishment became a mechanism for controlling not just individuals, but networks. A second historiographical sidebar: ancient authors often wrote to entertain, to moralize, or to condemn. Tacitus's narrative voice paradoxically condemns and magnifies imperial cruelty. Suetonius compiles scandal. Cassius Dio composes moral history. Where anecdotes are singular or exotic, modern historians ask whether these accounts reflect systemic practice or rhetorical technique. In reconstructing these punishments, we deliberately separate the level of reportage from the level of institutional law. When a method is reported by a single author, especially one with political motive, we treat it as an illustrative story with caveats. If we ask, at the close of the list, which punishment was most successful at erasing identity, the answer forces distinctions. Some punishments extinguished physical life, but left names and tombs intact. Others, damnatio memoriae, denial of burial, targeted the social afterlife. The most comprehensive obliteration combined both, to be killed and then denied a place in memory. The Roman imagination prized such totalities. Punishment served as sentence and symbol. There are practical lessons beneath the grim images. First, punishment is communication. Roman authorities designed penalties to teach obedience and to display sovereign competence. Second, law and violence are never separate. They are instruments of governance that cohere with religion, military needs, and spectacle. Third, memory is political. To erase a man's name or to prevent his burial was to assert a different kind of sovereignty over time, identity, and public story. Seneca, writing in his mordant way about cruelty, reminds us that the appetite for spectacle is a moral problem as much as a political one. He asks, in effect, whether the citizen who watches a body broken in public is implicated in the brutality by mere witnessing. His observation is not a legal argument. It is a moral provocation. The Roman system of punishments made bystanders into participants. The city that watched was, in part, the city that punished. Historical empathy does not require moral equalization. We can acknowledge Rome's achievements in engineering, law, and governance while refusing to romanticize the state's capacity to dehumanize. The catalogue of 12 punishments tells us more about political imagination than about innate barbarism. Rome's leaders chose methods that fit political needs: deterrence, theatricality, religious purity, or the assertion of dominance. As we close, consider this final image: a name chiseled from a temple wall. The face that once smiled down is a blank surface. A child in a later generation runs a finger over the nicked stone and feels nothing. The erasure is less complete than intended. Archaeology reads palimpsests where politics once tried to obliterate. That, in itself, is a kind of answer to the state's attempt to forget. The stones remember what law erased. Which of these 12 punishments struck you as most chilling? Which raised questions about the relationship between law, ritual, and power? If this inventory has moved you, leave a comment naming the punishment that shocked you most. If you want more episodes of unflinching historical reconstruction, carefully sourced, rigorously qualified, subscribe and join the conversation. To summarize the 12, the poenacule, the sack for parricide, the Tarpeian rock, public throwing for treason, decimation, lot-led slaughter for military breakdown, fustuarium, beating to death for dereliction, crucifixion, the slow public death reserved for non-citizens and rebels, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to wild beasts in staged spectacle, mors per ignem, burning with Neroan tails attached, execution by elephant, imperial spectacle of crushing, scaphism, the exotic, probably foreign method reported by classical authors, damnatio memoriae, systematic erasure from public memory, live burial of Vestal virgins, a religiously rationalized death, and denial of burial, social obliteration extending the punishments beyond the grave. One final historiographical reminder before we end. Our reconstruction depends on sources that are at once abundant and biased. Where multiple independent attestations exist, confidence is higher. Where a single vivid anecdote survives, Caution is required. For the viewer who loves history for its complexity, this is part of the fascination. Distinguishing the lore from the story, the ritual from the rumor. Rome used punishment as language, sometimes loud, sometimes surgical, sometimes symbolic. The 12 methods we have explored were instruments of that language, to terrify, to exclude, to shame, to demonstrate. They are reminders that systems of order create systems of violent pedagogy. They also remind us that memory resists erasure. Inscriptions, coins, chronicles, and now archaeology keep fragments of what history wants you to forget. If you found this inventory illuminating, like and share this video so this difficult part of Roman history reaches others. If you want a follow-up, tell us in the comments whether you would prefer an episode on comparative punishments, how another empire's punishments reflected its politics, or a close reading of a single case, like the Spartacus crucifixions. Read the sources, ask hard questions, remember the stones. Thank you for watching the 12 barbaric Roman punishments that history wants you to forget.